I'm pleased to introduce Jose Antonio Vargas. Jose is the Technology and Innovations Editor at the Huffington Post. Previously, he covered tech and video game culture as well as the 2008 presidential election for the Washington Post, where he also won a Pulitzer Prize as part of the team covering the Virginia Tech massacre. So I'm going to leave things in Jose's hands here, and he'll introduce our other panelists.
Great. Can you hear me? The mic is on, right? Great. Hi. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. Let me just, before introducing the panel, I guess I just kind of wanted to give a little background. I've been a journalist for a decade, 12 years now, and I can't think of a more exciting time to be a journalist. I think we really are kind of in the Enlightenment age in many ways and how people think of the media. And I think the biggest part of it is the me in the media, how individuals have a role and how the media ecology evolves from here on out with all the new technologies that we have. And as Craig had mentioned, the title of this panel is Social Media, Social Justice, and the Future of the Internet, which basically means we can talk about anything and everything. And to help me with that discussion, let me just briefly introduce some of the panelists here. To my left is James Rucker, who's the Executive Director of colorofchange.org. He's a co-founder of Color of Change and serves as its executive director. And Color of Change exists to strengthen Black America's political voice. We also have Deanna Sant, who is a media technologist and the author of a book that's coming out next month. So check it out, called Share This, How You Will Change the World with Social Networking. And she specializes in social media and is a leading expert in women and technology. And to my most immediate left is Andrew Noyes, who's a manager of public policy communications at Facebook. And before that, he was a journalist writing for The Hill and really did some stellar coverage of technology and politics. I actually wanted to jump in the first question. I don't know if anybody here was listening to the president's speech at Hampton University on Sunday, in which he said, and I quote, with iPads and iPods and Xboxes and PlayStations, none of which I know how to work, information becomes a distraction, a diversion, a form of entertainment, rather than a tool of empowerment, rather than the means of emancipation. When I first heard that, I just thought it was a little too simplistic of a view, especially coming from a president who benefited a lot from the new technologies. And I wonder if you guys had the same kind of reaction listening to the president basically school.
Yeah, my first reaction is that he was trying to appeal to the, you kids get off of my lawn contingent, like he... I wouldn't be surprised if it were actually some sort of positioning thing for him because he's so associated with being like the whiz-bang president when it comes to gadgets and stuff. Like everybody knows that he's pretty tech savvy. And so it was pretty out of place for him and patently wrong. None of this is a distraction. This is, it's an ecosystem of how we're living our lives, and that ecosystem is changing. And that's frightening for a lot of people. And I just get the feeling that he was trying to appeal to that audience for whom these things are kind of frightening and scary.
Yeah, No, I thought, there's a relevant point. There is information overload. There's the ability, and this is where I think actually conversations like are happening here are really important. It's very easy to think simply of technology as a means of entertainment or of communication that doesn't have some social value. It may be that, what I hope to see is that even if there's 1% of what happens, say, on the internet or using, new means of communication, that there's this 1% that actually strengthens democracy, it increases participation, it helps people represent themselves to others. And so you can focus on those elements of it that are, more or less, let's say, inconsequential in terms of social good. But there's the essence or an essence of the internet that I think has everything to do with empowerment. It just depends on what part of it you choose to look at. So yeah, simplistic.
Were you disappointed though in hearing what he had to say?
No, but I'm not disappointed. I've been, what is it? I've become accustomed to being disappointed or not, being.
All right.
A little jaded. No, so I think, as Deanna says, I think it actually sets the stage for us to focus the conversation in a particular way. That's useful.
Yeah, I mean, my initial reaction to that was, does he not remember 2008 election? Does he not remember the 2 million fans that he had on Facebook leading up to Election Day? The 1 million people who used a Facebook app to remind people to vote on Election Day? And then the other thing, the more immediate example that I thought of when you mentioned that was with the UK elections last week.
Yeah.
Which I think, I mean, if this is an example of what's to come for our elections in 2010 and beyond, I'm just like, the sky is really the limit. So just a real quick snapshot of what happened in the UK elections through Facebook. We had 2 million Facebook users in the UK out of 26 million use the I voted badge. That's compared to about 5.5 million U.S. users who used that in 2008. We had like 68, almost 70,000 people added the Vote Badge app to their profile. We had, 180,000 votes in a joint Facebook-YouTube digital debate with 5,300 questions asked for the major party leaders. It just, you know, I don't know.
I mean, so again, this is people getting involved in politics, getting involved in election, which actually, I think this is a good segue. You know, when I was at the Washington Post and even now at the Huffington Post, I cover marriage and politics and the internet. This is really an area of coverage that the Washington press corps does not do very well at all, if even. So I think, you know, when you have the president making that statement about the iPads, the distraction, the foreign entertainment, that is like the typical way that people think of, in many ways, technology circa 2001. Yeah. You know, like, do you guys have anything to add about how, in many ways, the mainstream media has failed in the way it covers how people use technology?
Yes, and how people use technology, because a lot of old school media systems are fairly threatened. Their business models are threatened by newer technologies and whatnot. And I also think that one of the things that makes a media core kind of culture not happy about these things, and this is something that I write about extensively in my book.
It's called Share This.
It's called Share This.
It's out next month.
It's out next month. Pre-order now on Amazon. No, seriously, one of the things that I cover a lot when I'm writing about technology and talking about technology is what we're seeing now is all of these people are coming into these giant public conversations that we're having. And these are voices that either previously went unheard, were ignored, were unable to participate. And when you have all different kinds of people of color, women, queer folk, all of these people coming into these conversations, they're shaping the conversations with their values and their experiences. And every public conversation somehow ends up shaping policy in some way, or somehow changes the culture in some way. It makes a difference through that participation. And that's where the media is uncomfortable, I think, as a kind of monolith. You know, there's obviously,
I mean, because, you know, we're supposed to tell you how to think.
Yeah.
You know,
there's that,
thing, right? Yeah.
And this is actually another example that's very new for us. You're talking about kind of the old mainstream media not getting it. Facebook launched social plugins recently, a couple weeks ago. It's basically the technology that lets you go to CNN.com and click like on a story and let your friends on Facebook know that you like that story. And some of the early statistics that we've gotten back from websites, from some of these more mainstream media sites that are using this technology, it's pretty incredible. ABCnews.com, for example, has told us that they've had a 250% increase in their referral traffic just from implementing that.
Referral traffic meaning?
From Facebook.
From Facebook,
okay. Right.
Yeah.
And your former employer, the Washington Post, reported a 290% increase. So in a way, I mean, they are coming around, they are kind of allowing people to not only get involved in the dialogue, but think for themselves and share their views with people. And I think that in a way, I mean, the technologies that we have and that other new media companies are providing are kind of maybe breathing new life into kind of a stale old medium. And it's really exciting.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, in terms of the media coverage, I actually maybe again, a jadedness or a lack of expectations. But I think in general, mainstream media is not really great at unearthing or discovering innovation and talking about it, right? Until it's kind of already somewhat obvious.
Oh yeah, those trend stories that you read every Sunday in the New York Times. No offense to the New York Times, but yes.
No, but, if you read like a technical journal, or you read, basically, which is kind of a niche journal, right?
Yeah.
Then you'll discover what's coming, or even what's happening that's a little bit beyond the surface or below the surface. I do think you're right, and this is what on the one hand, this is why, to me, and not to get into preservation of net neutrality conversation, there's a way in which the platform of the internet, the way in which people are connected in a unorganized, or at least has the ability to organize and reorganize for, like you say, individual or small groups' voices to have an impact in ways that will change a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. And you're absolutely right. I mean, people said, old media is done. Well, things are happening in a way such that old media is being pushed and shifted and kind of reworked, engaged differently. And so with these bigger brands like you're talking about, they do not have to own everything to actually be a real significant player.
Well, I mean, to me, one of the most interesting and impactful kind of emerging themes that we're seeing is that news is social, right? The fact that people want to share the news, the fact that I get an email from somebody saying, hey, so how come this newspaper covered it, but that blog didn't cover it, or the other way around, right? And actually, my question, actually back to James, is, how are minority groups in particular, African Americans? I mean, we look back at what happened with Jena 6, right? That's not something that you read in the Washington Post or the New York Times. I mean, that was something that the Black blogosphere, had to really drumbeat and say that we're covering this. We can talk about how Hispanics groups reacted to the Sotomayor nomination. We can talk about how the very vibrant gay blogosphere is reacting to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Like, how are these minority groups pushing mainstream media in the way that they cover these issues?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, because what you see, and in fact, there's an example from a few days ago. There was a Latino who was killed in Arizona by his neighbor.
Oh, yeah, I heard about this.
And he was called, went back, he was told to go back home, and so on and so forth. That preceded him being shot. The way the media covered it, it was local news media, and then became a national story, but the local media said this was not a racial incident. The sheriff said it's not a racial incident, and then you look at the reporters, this is not a racial incident. Although the things that
because
we know...
wetback isn't all that offensive of a term, right? Okay.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, and I bring that up because it reminds me of the Jena 6.
Yeah.
Where pretty early on, it was one of these stories when we got about a half dozen emails from our members saying, here's the situation. I actually thought there must be something not true here, right? There was some missing key detail that made this not true. Of course, it was true. But even after a lot of lead work had been done, it wasn't just, us. Many folks had interviewed families, some activists on the ground. The mainstream media wasn't comfortable yet telling the story, didn't know how they wanted to tell the story. And even then, there were some kind of key gruesome details, like the DA in this case, telling these kids he could take away their lives with the stroke of his pen. There were many kind of moments of misconduct. Those weren't part of the mainstream story. The mainstream story was it's an old southern town, there's black and white race-based tensions. There was an inability to really tell a story. Right, so we went to our members, and because we have a free and open internet, we were able to communicate, here's the story. You, everyday people, can put pressure on the media. We'll tell the story, and then the media will have to decide whether or not they'll actually amplify it or ignore it. And of course, when you get tens of thousands of people marching to some small town in central Louisiana, you have a story. But that I think, there is this key ability, the fact that a blogger can communicate something that the mainstream media doesn't, get on first, and create a story and force the media to do the mainstream media to behave differently. One thing I just wanted to point out, another project that I helped start was called Video the Vote, just in terms of where things can go. And what's interesting is that on election day, you have limited cameras from networks, network affiliates, or kind of the news, the television or print news. We as voters are everywhere, right? We can be at every precinct. And so the idea was to enable everyday people who cared about protecting elections to be the eyes and ears for election protection where the media just couldn't be. And so in 2006, we started that, and it actually provided content for mainstream news organizations who said, this is great because we simply can't be everywhere. And again, that's everyday people actually creating news that's then influencing, the mainstream media.
We saw a similar thing with Facebook and Flickr and Twitter and other sites surrounding the Haiti earthquake.
Yeah.
I mean, all of the traditional infrastructure was down. There was no way for the reports on the ground to reach the outside world, and people were using their mobile phones to communicate photos and text and really kind of help the mainstream media report what was happening in those very early hours and days on the ground in Haiti. And you saw, I mean, a lot of the relief organizations on the ground, their only way to communicate back to their home base was through all of these social media tools. So that was, a similar way that we saw.
Do you get a feeling, though, that we're almost kind of at a tipping point here? I mean, in many ways, I get the sense when it comes to politics and when it comes to news consumption, that the readers, the voters, are actually ahead of either the news organizations or ahead of the politicians, right? The behavior is telling us something about where technology is leading people. I mean, my interest in technology has always been about behavior, what it tells us about human behavior. Where are we with that? I mean, in terms of how people want to be involved. Again, this idea of having the me in the media and having a part in the media and telling the stories and shaping the stories.
One of the most interesting things about working with social technologies, I've been involved in, I've been a geek since I was 7. My parents brought our first computer home in 1982. It was a TI-99 4A for the geeks in the audience. Yes, it was pretty awesome. In any case, I've been involved in web technologies. I've been a longtime activist, for 15, 20 years now. And one of the most interesting things to me about this moment is that the technologies that we're seeing are actually not about technology at all.
No,
in many
not.
ways. It's what we're doing is we're facilitating very natural kind of primal human instincts to be connected to one another, to feel part of something and to participate in a common culture. I think the structure of mass communications over the last 100 years has largely led us down these paths of isolation, which breeds apathy. When you're isolated from one another, when you're not connected to one another, apathy, foments and is widespread. And what we're seeing now is when I participate in these kinds of, if I blog, if I'm on Facebook or Twitter or what have you, and I'm sharing kind of the daily minutiae of my life with one another, with other people, it creates what a tech writer for the New York Times calls ambient awareness of one another. We have this, it doesn't necessarily mean anything that, I posted that I just brushed my teeth or what I have for breakfast or all those famous stories that people say, oh, this is so annoying. But over time, if you're sort of holistically, from a wide-angle lens, aware of what's happening with me, you're participating and aware of what's happening in my life, and that creates empathy. Empathy is the opposite of apathy, and it's much more than just being sympathetic to a cause or feeling bad when something bad happens in the world. It's actually sharing in another human being's emotions, and that's profoundly different than the way we've been able to live our lives for the last 100 years. So certainly, where we are now is actually not about technology at all. It's about our commonness and our humanity.
Actually, you brought up a point, and I wanted to ask you this particularly. I mean, women throughout history have always been kind of left out, like writing the first. I mean, if journalism is the first draft of history, in many ways, women haven't been written in the way that they should have been written about. Like, what do you there was latest statistics from Facebook that said nearly 57% of Facebook users are actually women.
Yeah, that's actually common throughout most social networks, except for
it's a much more women. Yeah,
except for Dig. Dig is the only one that's dude heavy, and the.
Because you know why? It's competition.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
Well, it's also I actually just was at this. I think women. I don't think it's just that it's competition. I think it's actually a different style of participation that was. I'm thinking a lot about the difference between competition and combativeness, and I think Dig appeals to a more combative environment, or creates a more combative environment than necessarily a competitive environment. And it's actually the trend on most social networks that more than 50% of the people participating on Twitter, on Facebook, MySpace, a number of networks are actually women. And I think that we're at a point now where women's stories can be heard, and women's stories are being heard in a very different way when we think about in the wake of the assassination of Dr. Tiller last year, the late-term abortion doctor in Kansas, one of the most amazing things that happened after that were the number of women that came out and said, this is why I had my late-term abortion. This is my story. This is why the work of men like him is critical, or people like him is absolutely critical. And these are the things that we need to keep providing. And it humanized this terrible topic that nobody wants to talk about, because it's not a great experience for anyone to have to go through. And women are more willing to start sharing those stories and again, infusing the culture with their values. And it's incredible.
I mean, I think it's always important to point that when we talk about new technologies, it's not as if everybody can do this. And we can probably take a drive a mile away from here to like Ward 8 in Anacostia and go to a public housing project where there's no computer somewhere, which is why I think it's important to always bring up this idea of the digital divide. You know, nearly 3 years ago, remember when YouTube and CNN partnered up with the Democratic debate? I actually went to South Carolina 2 days earlier, and I went to a public housing project and found out that only 45% of people in Charleston can actually go to the internet or have access to internet, and that mirrored the national average. Last fall, the survey said 2/3 of Americans have access to high-speed internet. Although this is a key figure, 96% of homes have 2 or fewer choices for broadband service. So, which gets me to this point of, from a government perspective, from a regulation perspective, but also from an organizational perspective, like, what can we do to better that figure? 2/3 of Americans have access. There's a full 1/3 of people in this country in the age of Google, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter that have no access to internet. How do we address that?
Well, one thing I want to jump in is to clarify also that there are multiple digital divides.
Yes.
There's not just one access divide.
Yes.
There is also the skill level divide. If you have a child who is accessing the internet primarily by going to the library and has a set period of time that they're allowed to use it and is restricted perhaps by what content they're allowed to access, they're going to come out of that situation with a profoundly different skill level and skill set than a child who has his or her own laptop, and so we can't just think about this, kind of if we just give them all broadband, everybody will be fine, like there's multiple, we need a nuanced we need a multi-vectored approach to this, and there's a rising movement that I've noticed of people trying to encourage, coming off of the kind of media literacy movement and teaching kids media literacy as well as a sort of tech literacy or a digital literacy. So I think those kinds of programs are going to be key to think about.
Yeah, and maybe this is obvious to everyone, but I mean, there is an opportunity. I mean, essentially, we subsidize to make sure everyone has telephone service on some basic level, because the presumption is if you can't take a phone call, you can't, schedule a job interview, right? You're cut off from society in a certain kind of way. And I think with children, maybe it's not quite like this. Maybe it's overstated somewhat. But what a child ingests in terms of food has so much to do with their brain development. I saw a little YouTube video of a 2.5-year-old with an iPad.
Yeah. Pretty
fat. Did other people see this? In San Francisco, everyone saw it.
San Francisco,
No, but it's this 2.5-year-old who's a pro at this device and is able to search and do all these things in this virtual space. But I think of a kid who has very little access to technology, who's told, let's say, no, don't do that. Just to kind of, I'm just imagining the kind of development.
What kind of brain that's creating,
But in any case, I think, there are many ways, I think, and as Deanna says, I think there are many approaches that are needed to expand, to make broadband available, and there's what you do with it. But I actually, and I don't know the numbers, but I know that in a lot of low-income households, there's cable television.
There's cable television,
but
cable, not necessarily internet access.
Not necessarily internet access.
Exactly.
So, but for the most part, you're able to carry internet over cable. So, I think what is needed is a recognition. Hopefully, there's some public education around the value of broadband. And again, it's not just so you can see some random YouTube video. that there are these rich developmental experiences if you're participating, if you want to participate in society to the fullest. There's a need for people to actually be connected, and those who are not will be left behind in a pretty profound way, and we actually believe we can solve that.
The only other thing I'd point out is a segment of the population that I've been focusing a lot lately, and we were actually involved in a project to help out with this, but older Americans, I think, are, I mean, on our platform on Facebook, you know, we see, the statistics show that, you know, a huge number of our new users are you know, 50 and up, and I think that that even 60 and up, I mean, there are just so many opportunities to reach that demographic and to help really explain to them why the value in broadband and what they can do. And I think that that's a segment of the population that's often overlooked. Certainly those who are lower income individuals and people who just simply can't get access for those reasons, that's obviously very important, but there's this whole other set that I think is also being ignored.
I mean, to me, two fundamental questions that I always have about this is internet access a fundamental right?
Yes. Sorry. Sorry.
Great.
Sorry.
And the other thing is, I used to volunteer at Cardozo High School around here, which is like 10 blocks from the White House. And I remember being in a class once in which only 3 of the kids actually had computers at home. At this time, right, they made it seem as if the iPad was going to solve the media's problem, right? As if anybody can just afford $600 for an iPad. But is one kid, one laptop, is that something that in this globalized tech economy, is that something that we should be thinking about? Internet access is a fundamental right, and does every student in this country deserve a laptop?
You know, yes, I believe internet access, obviously. I just blurted it out.
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Mom. Sorry about that. So, I mean, to me, it's so much like running water or providing
infrastructure.
Infrastructure. It's clearly, it's not going away anytime soon. It's clearly critical to operating successfully, as you mentioned, you know, and being a successful part of the society. That it's becoming more and more critical. I don't know that the one laptop, one child. It's a nice idea.
Some cities have been looking at it. Some little cities, but
I don't want to underestimate the power of mobile devices. Yeah. However, you know, beyond, you know, just the iPad, what a future tablet, you know, kind of situation look like, larger, more interactive devices that we have now. And, you know, while mobile isn't any kind of magic bullet that's going to solve any kind of access divide anytime soon, we can look and see where it's already making a huge difference, especially in the organizing and politics arena. When you look at the immigration marches, you know, 2006 was, you know, already 4 years ago. Largely the kind of, they called it the last mile organizing was done via text message. So those are the kinds of things I wouldn't want to just limit it to the idea of like, oh, just give every kid a laptop and we'll be fine.
As a former journalist, I'm always more comfortable in that seat, and I certainly don't have any answer to this question, but every time we talk about whether the internet, whether ubiquitous broadband is a fundamental right, you know, you have to look at the dollar signs, and then you have to think of, well, who's
paying for it?
Who's going to pay for it? Whose responsibility is it? Is it government? Is it the pipeline providers? Is it the sites that? Is it the content providers? I mean, again, I don't have an answer to this, but that's certainly in an economy like ours, that's always going to be the question: is who's going to foot the bill?
Yeah, and you know, I'm not an expert in this, but to me, what I hope for, actually, beyond whether it's one laptop, one child, or even looking at mobile, all these things are going to change, right? You know, we've had tablet computing for, I don't know, over a decade, but no one used it, and now it's, you know, kind of becoming this thing, and it may be that in 3 years, our mobile devices we won't have. We'll have a smaller iPad in our bag, and we'll have little Bluetooth or something. And you just
called an iPhone.
Whatever it is, yeah. But I think what's really, I think the burden is on us. effectively, right? It's those who can advocate for and influence government and use our money, right, government money, to make that investment in everyone. You make an investment in those who are older, who will be left behind as they get older and things change, and those who are younger, who you want them to compete on a level playing field. We can make investments to make it so. I don't believe. I mean, a corporation that is involved in, say, laying the pipes, they're a business, a for-profit business. I expect that we should, as we give them right of way to dig up the ground, well, there's something that we can expect in return, let's say. Or we make direct investments to make it such that where it doesn't make business sense to go, they actually go. So I think there's a responsibility on the part of governments, on the part of everyday people who are, those who support the government, to get the notion in play that this is basic core infrastructure and to paint the picture of what it looks like when folks don't have access to it.
I mean, is it becoming a civil rights issue?
Yeah, I think so. And for a while, I'm very wary of throwing around the term rights.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
I really am. But when we sent an email to our members, Color of Change members about this, we talked about it as a 21st century civil rights issue. And the reason is because the telephone becomes a great example. If you've got people who are trying to participate in society, but they actually can't effectively, and the Commissioner Clyburn talked about, this idea of participation, I believe she was talking about, advocacy, being able to advocate for yourself. Given the other interests that can lean on government to have it serve them, what does it look like if you're from a community where your individual voice, or you and 100 other people, can not only be ignored, will systemically be ignored if you're not able to be a part of a certain platform. So that's why I think it sets us up for classes of folks to be completely denied rights unless they have access to someone who does have access. And that's just doesn't make for a functioning, a healthy democracy.